So since this is a descriptive sensory evaluation, heavy importance is given to the training of panelists. There are three main purposes to panelist training. The first is to familiarize one with the test procedures. So each sensory evaluation descriptive test would have a very unique procedure. Each product would have a different way of doing the test, although there are general formats, but each research would have a very different method despite having similar formats. The second would be to improve ability to recognize sensory attributes in complex food systems. So as we know, for example, when you taste something, there are probably hundreds of compounds contributing to certain flavor attributes. Okay, so you want to isolate those, and those can usually be done with experience. So bihira yung mga tao na parang ala cooking master boy, yung mga dila nila isang tike, masasabi sa'yo yung kung ano-anong details tungkol sa pagkain. The rest are just above average people who are, due to the result of training, able to tell the differences in food. So in my case, I'm not particularly very good sa sensory kumpara sa ibang tao in terms of yung acuity ng dila ko. However, since I spent 2 years in the ice cream industry, at least pagdating sa realm ng mga ice cream ingredients and flavors that we use in the industry, mas kaya kong mag-discriminate dun sa strength ng say vanilla flavor, chocolate flavor, differences nila, and so on. Last would be improving the sensitivity and memory, provide precise, consistent, and standardized sensory measurements. So sabi ko nga sa descriptive, para kayong mga laboratory apparatus na kinakalibrate. So for example, if there are 6 of you, then that's like having 6 pH meters, and training is like the calibration that you do to your pH meter so that they would all read the same sample with the same pH reading. Okay? And that would have to depend a lot on the memory nga, kasi una kailangan mong ma-identify yung sensory attribute, a flavor note, a texture, or something, and then you must quantify it with respect to your references. And the person beside you or all the other persons in your team must be able to do the same. So once na-screen mo na yung panel members mo, pinapasok mo na sila, ay kailangan silang i-orient. Unlike the normal sensory eval orientation, na 5 minutes lang, this one will probably take a few sessions, not even just one session probably. Okay? So you need a very good training environment. All others apply, yung controlled conditions, yung sa noise levels, lahat yun nag-a-apply. Members should understand the importance of the test. So yung pinaka-objective, because they're part of meeting that objective, then dapat ma-ingrain sa kanila para saan ba ito, ano yung gusto nating mangyari, para malaman nila ito yung magiging contribution ko dito sa project, and hindi ako pwedeng magkamali. I can't screw up this one because if the erroneous data comes from me, then the whole project may be jeopardized. Next is understanding the importance of concentration and allowing of sufficient time to complete tasks. Sa sensory, hindi naman ito pabilisan, no? If it would take you a while longer to discern or discriminate, then so be it. Although, of course, there are standards you must meet, especially if, let's say, taking a very, very long time may pose certain problems, especially when it comes to temperature-sensitive samples that may need to be reheated, and maybe the reheating might affect the sensory attributes. Just as with our normal sensory panelists, the panel members are required to avoid strong taste sensations and odorous materials for at least half an hour prior to the evaluation. That includes smoking, drinking, and using mouthwash. As usual, our guidelines regarding the use of cosmetics and soaps with odors should be followed, as well as yung pag-report ng mga illnesses Kasi kung may sipon ka nga naman, wala kang panlasa, wag ka nang mag-participate sa descriptive evaluation. Alright, and in case of having bias towards a sample, at the very least, kaya dapat ng mga panelists maging objective. So kahit gaano ka pangit para sa'yo yung attributes ng sample na yun, whether it's taste, aroma, texture, or the like, you should be able to still calibrate yourself with the references and give the most objective response you could. So test methods for descriptive sensory evaluation, usually a session would take maybe 1 to 2 hours, no? And there are different phases dun sa buong training and the actual descriptive sensory phase. So kailangan mo na ma-orient yung mga tao sa procedures ng test, and then yung maraming training sessions nila. Depende sa format ng test, pwedeng individual or group yung sessions. And sometimes you can use the reference samples during discussion, and there could be an exchange of information para ma-clarify yung mga bagay tungkol sa sensory. Okay? Dun sa particular product and procedure combination mo. And the training time is also a function of the product, test procedures being used, and the capability of the panelist. So usually, pag mas simple yung product, mas konti yung attributes, mas mabilis. Pero kung talagang masakit sa ulo yung mga very complex na produkto, like for example, you're profiling fruits, okay? And maraming varieties yan, kahit na nanggaling sa same na lupain, pwede may pagkakaiba sila sa lasa or texture or what, no? As opposed to rating manufactured products which have a very straightforward profile, reproducible profile. So how does training start? We assume that, for example, hindi man lang food tech or hindi rin kumuha ng sensory evaluation class yung iba sa mga panelists mo. And therefore, yung basics ng physiology with respect to the senses, no, yung mga unang lectures natin on the senses, kailangan din silang i-lecture tungkol doon. Alam nila paano gumagana yung mga senses natin with respect to the evaluation of food. And then, there could be actual product evaluations using samples for open discussion. So parang testing the waters pa lang ito. Ito yung produkto natin, tikman nyo, amuyin nyo, nguya-nguyain nyo, hawak-hawakan nyo, titigan nyo. And then, what can you say? Okay. Then, if need be, no, unless meron ng pre-made na vocabulary beforehand, yung team mismo yung gagawa ng vocabulary. Okay. So this includes defining the terms that the sensory attributes, picking the proper scale, and then even up to the point of choosing the references. You also need to discuss, of course, yung order kung paano nyo i-evaluate yung mga attributes, including such things as aftertaste and overall evaluations of the product. So to aid in the development of vocabulary, it's usually good to have on hand yung iba't ibang klase ng mga references na pwedeng mag-define dun sa attribute na yon. For example, you might want a chemical that isolates a certain aroma na yun lang yung laman ng chemical compound na yon, na pag inamoy nila, ito pala yung kailangan kong hanapin na, let's say, if you have limonene, sa dinami-dami ng mga maaamoy mo sa isang citrus fruit, pag naamoy may reference ng limonene, alam mo na ito yon. Okay? Na hindi mo, parang i-select mo yon and i-disregard mo yung ibang mga naamoy mo. Right? And also in developing the vocabulary, you are exposed to the samples which are representative of the product so that you can also try to describe. No? Usually, yung step 1 sa exercise ninyo is you write down all the words you could use to associate the product with in terms of sensory attributes. Is it sweet, sour? Is it may metallic aftertaste ba siya? Mga ganon. And all kinds of words you could use to describe. Kasi baka mamaya, meron kang masulat doon, tapos yung isang panelist, hindi niya ma-describe, pero nung narinig niya yung sinabi mo, eureka moment. That's what I was looking for. That's the term I was looking for. So again, as need be during training, we have what they call these reference materials, which again defines the certain sensory characteristics. This may be visual, olfactory in nature, or pwede ring a sample that you can taste, a sample that you can touch, or a sample that you can masticate, no? So, as long as it accurately or as close as possible, dinedefine niya yung attribute na gusto mong ipinpoint, then you can use it as a reference material. And usually, we have reference materials for the high intensity and the low intensity. Generally though, you do not want to present these until they are familiar with the product, so that ma-reduce yung mga bias natin. If you're a company which works with a certain product, competitors' products may also prove useful in increasing the group's experience. No? For example, if you have a milk chocolate drink, okay, and medyo malawak yung market niyan, kung nandun ka sa powdered category, meron yung malted tsaka non-malted, di ba? So, kung nandun ka sa frame of mind na ang milk chocolate drinks lang na alam mo ay yung mga may malt, paano mo na lang mapapasok dun sa definition mo yung mga attributes na wala dun sa malted drinks, or vice versa. Kung non-malt yung alam mo, di wala sa radar mo yung mga sensory attributes related to malt. Okay? So sometimes product aging is real. The texture of the product may be affected, like yung mga crispy products that lose crispness over time, or those maybe fruits and vegetables, no, na depende sa maturity nila, nag-iiba yung appearance, yung texture, maging yung lasa. So sometimes you might want to put in a few variations of products, the same product with different ages, okay? And then the scale to be used depends totally on the sensory analyst, but again, you must take into consideration ano yung capability ng panelists mo. Kaya ba nila ng 150 points of discrimination or hanggang 7 lang? And of course, you want to look at the performance of the judges through statistical analysis of training data. So sa training, makikita mo sino yung outlier. There are statistical software you could use for this. Meron ding mga freeware na pwede nating gamitin. And you could see na yung data pwede mong tingnan by panelist, and then overall, yung mga means. You can do all sorts of statistical tests to look at how they're performing and so on. And you could have corrective sessions optionally. Depende kung may confusion doon. Like nakita mo, itong sa lahat ng ibang attributes, okay sila, magkakalapit yung sagot nila, well within, walang masyadong outlier and all. Pero bakit pagdating doon sa isang attribute na ito, ang layo, parang they're all over the place. That means probably some of them do not understand the definition. Perhaps malaman-laman nyo na meron palang mga individuals who do not detect as easily these type of sensory attribute. So there are certain standards for sniffing. Of course, mas strict tayo kaysa sa consumer tests. Kasi sa consumer tests, you allow them to interact with the food as they would as consumers, pero dito dapat standardized tayo. So again, short sniffs versus long inhalations, sniffing enough to reach a decision but not so much to become desensitized. So kailangan mabilis, isang amoy, dalawang amoy, alam mo na yung hinahanap mo. Pag paulit-ulit mong inaamoy yan over time, then of course ikaw yung mapafatig yung ilong mo. So short bunny sniffs are recommended with mouth shut while sniffing. One technique that we use as sensory is sniffing the back of the palm to equilibrate ourselves with our own body odor, no? Kasi parang neutral na sa'yo yung amoy mo, kaya yun yung pinapaamoy instead of something else. Okay? And of course, dahil wala ka namang perfume na sinuot that day, dapat neutral nga talaga yun. And normally, there will be variations in adapting time, but this should be usually less than 30 seconds. So may rest period ka in between samples. However, yun nga, hindi naman pwedeng sobrang tagal mong nakaupo lang. Okay. Tasting techniques are usually largely dependent on the food sample and the type of test. So generally, you need enough food in your mouth and they should be standardized para maging pantay-pantay evaluation. So if you're describing the crispness of a potato chip or cracker, kailangan mong identify gaano kalaking piece yung isusubo mo. Halfway through ba siya, tapos you bite with your incisors. If you're judging for gumminess, how many times should you chew with your molars, and so on. Okay, in certain cases, samples with slow developing flavors require that the sample be kept in the judge's mouth for a certain amount of time before swallowing or expectoration. Para standardized din. Kasi meron talaga mga bagay na sa unang kagat, unang nguya, pag nilunok mo agad, hindi mo madadama talaga yung tunay na pangyayari, no? So, that would have to be determined by the analyst beforehand para may ballpark figure ka. You can make it a certain range, but then again, kasi hindi mo pwedeng strictly 5 seconds, no more, no less. Or strictly tatlong nguya lang ng molar. Diba? So, may konting leeway naman, depende sa sample mo. Of course, some samples that disintegrate very quickly may require certain attributes to be evaluated, let's say, on the first bite and so on. Okay, so again, as much as possible, dapat ay standardized. Hindi pwedeng yung isa nilunok agad, yung isa isang minutong inaya yung sample. Okay? You may need to swallow sometimes for taste and odor release. Again, meron ng mga bagay na nararanasan mo lang pag nilunok na dumaan sa lalamunan mo. But again, take note that fatigue could happen, especially when you have many samples. There might also be safety considerations regarding the test. So anything from maybe allergies to irritation from super spicy food or what. Pero generally, dapat lang talagang sanay kumain nito yung panelist mo, no? So, sa texture evaluation, more or less ginagaya mo kasi yung mga texture profile analysis machines. Pero gamit mo yung bibig ng tao. Kasi yun naman yung basis nun. Kaya na-develop yung texture profile na machine, mga force compression machine, para supposed to be gayahin yung bibig ng tao. So, we're doing it in reverse now here. There are a lot of terminology that we could choose from, like what is hardness, what is chewiness, what is gumminess, and we could translate these to our specific samples as to how we will measure them. First bite, second bite, ilang nguya, ano yung hahanapin mo, and so on. In this case, we need standard procedures for evaluation. Sometimes you start with the base material and then you develop it with a panel kung paano nyo siya gagawin. Yun nga lang, kapag ginawa niyo yun na marami kayong ginawang minor tweaks, hindi na siya magiging comparable if there are other studies that use the untweaked version of your procedure. And then we should also be able to describe the forces used in the mouth in manipulation and mastication and standardize them as well. Minsan baka kailangan pa pang ilang molar yan. Paano yung panelist na kulang ng isang ngipin, ganun, pero walang dentures. So we have to take that into consideration. So you could probably pause this slide just to read through some of the definitions. I'll just read through some of them. So 2A, springiness, degree to which sample returns to original shape after a certain time period. So if you're gonna use this, kailangan mong i-define yung time period na yon. And if you're gonna use the same no recovery, or very springy as your endpoints in the scale, or something else. Okay. For example, here, crispness, the force, noise with which the sample breaks or fracture is characterized by many small breaks from not crisp to very crisp. So in this case, crispness is something that you evaluate with your ears as you um, chew or fracture the sample. So, as part of the training process, we monitor the panelists periodically by statistically running through their performance, like if you're doing trial testing of using the scales. And you can see which panelists need improvement and kung saan nila kailangan ng improvement. It may be may isang certain term lang na nagkakaproblema yung panel or certain panelists, and so on. So you start with checking the consistent use of the terms, kung talaga bang naintindihan nyo pag sinabi nating mapakla, ano ibig sabihin nun, ano yung hahanapin mo, okay? And dahil kaunti lang kayo, kahit may isa man lang panel member or yung buong panel yung nahihirapan, kung kailangan, meron mga remedial class additional training sessions to examine correct areas of difficulty. So usually, a training session would last a few times a week for a few months. I mean, yung total training for a certain product, no? Unlike yung gagawin niya sa class, which is just 3 sessions, walang-wala yun sa totoong panelist training. So generally, you use one-way ANOVA as a way of measuring interaction between associated with each subject's responses. And usually, ito yung tinitingnan natin. Kasi bago mo malaman kung may product differences nga, titingnan mo muna kung dun sa subjects mismo ay may differences, no? Kasi since yung mga assessors natin ay hindi naman tayo, kung marami kang magkakaibang pH meter na pinang-test ng pH, dalawa yung variability mo dyan. Pwedeng totoong may variability yung pH ng samples, or wala talagang variability yung samples, yung pH meter lang yung meron. Or on the other hand, dahil sa laki ng standard dev ng panelists mo, ay pwedeng hindi mo totoong masabi kung may difference nga ba yung samples or wala. So just like our other statistical tests, you can derive probability values, p-values from the f-ratios from the one-way ANOVA regarding knowing the individual contribution of each characteristic to the discrimination of differences. Okay? So this means kung halimbawa sa meron kang 10 sensory characteristics. So each one of those may isang analysis of variance, and then you could have the f-values. Kung yung p-values rather. So kung mas maliit yung probability value niya, mas malaki yung possible contribution niya sa differentiation among the products. Now, for example, posibleng itong tatlong chocolate drink na ito ay walang masyadong difference pagdating sa sweetness. Pero dun sila nagkakaiba sa maybe bitter aftertaste or sa strength of cocoa flavor, or perhaps sa malt flavor, especially if you're comparing malted versus non-malted beverages. So although these are dummy values, but looking at the way it's done, so for each panelist, you would have a p-value under each of the sensory attributes being tested across all samples. And of course, titingnan nila yan. And the p-value here is less than 0.5, not 0.05, okay, to be clear. So an example of the use for one-way ANOVA for monitoring sensory performance can be seen in the publication by our very own Dr. Villarino and Professor Emerita Dr. Lizarda, where because of the ANOVA requirements of having a P less than 0.5, only 8 panelists are finally considered for getting the data from dun sa BCO samples kasi nga even if there were more than 8 panelists, based on these results, ma-jeopardize yung integrity ng data kung sinama nila yung mga panelists na based sa ANOVA ay hindi naman talaga kayang mag-discriminate. So in this case, ANOVA was used to call out the non-discriminators in the panel. So kapag sakto na alam na ng panel leader na enough na yung training, you can start by serving the actual products na i-analyze, okay? Of course, this has to be done in a replicated fashion and then random balanced order din. So as to the rule of thumb, for the number of replications, generally it's between 6 to 10, but first time group of, let's say yung binuo mo for the panel and then majority of them were recruited and were not really trained panelists for other products, you may need as much as 12 replications, whereas for sensory experts who have been familiarized with different products and various processes can do with as little as 4 to 6. Either way, kaya siya magastos kasi tingnan niyo naman, gagastos ka ng ilang buwan sa training ng mga tao before kang makapag gawa ng first testing mo for the product. So if you're gonna do this in the Philippines, in terms of manpower, this could easily be in the hundreds of thousands of pesos to a million pesos or so just for the panelist training bago ka pa makapag-evaluate ng product mo. Okay, sa same na pera na yon, makakapag-develop ka na actually ng isa or more na products for sale, no?